Coastal areas, I think in the Highlands in particular, we're very well blessed with a mix of coastal types. And many of the hard coastal areas that we have, in a sense, they will adapt themselves. I mean, if the sea level rises a bit, if there's increasing storminess, probably they will survive, more or less as they are. I think the particular challenges relate to low-lying coast, and I threw in one from the Western Isles. I know it's not Highland, but you can expand a wee bit. I think what we've got on the western side of Scotland, in the Western Isles and down into some of the Argyll Islands, are really challenging in terms of the mackerel habitat and how we maintain and what we can do in that particular area. So coast will change overall. I think the challenge is to focus our attention on the real priority areas. I think what's interesting there is to try and make sure that we look after the people in these areas as well as we look after the habitats in these areas. And the two are so linked that I think we have to look to get some sort of community involvement to speculate about what might happen in the future. So big challenges on the coast. That was a very quick example. The second one relates to mountains. And again, obviously, in the Highlands, we're very well endowed with mountain habitat that really is quite unique, not just in a Scottish context, but in a European and indeed in a global context in terms of the mix of habitats and species that we find in areas like the Cairngorms in particular. So they're a great resource from a natural perspective, also from an economic tourism and from a forestry perspective as well to a degree. So what might happen to them? Well, we have areas, obviously, in the high tops of snowbed, and some of you may have seen last week a bit of press coverage there was about work that's happened to, being concluded about snowbed distribution and how persistent it will be in future. The prediction is that the snowbed vegetation will decrease in extent, that snowbeds themselves will become much less common. And indeed, if you look over the past 10 years, the snow lie in the Cairngorms has contracted hugely. So there are real challenges there for SNH in relation to the natural world, but to others in relation to how we use and what we do with the Cairngorms in particular. This isn't a terribly, maybe it's better actually up there than it is in my projector. It is. One thing we've done is to look to see what would happen if temperatures increase and the Arctic alpine habitat essentially moves up the hill. So if it went from, let's say, from 600 metres, where it is more or less now, up to above 875 metres up the hill, what would that look like in terms of a future scenario? And you can see from the map nearest to me that actually it's quite a dramatic change that could happen. And I think what's worrying is the predictions are that that could be within the next 50 to 100 year period. So in one sense, just beyond our lifetime, you could see quite a dramatic contraction of that high, very high top snowbed, that sort of Arctic alpine vegetation. So there's a lot happening there in relation to mountains in particular. Think skiing, think how we use that area. So there is a real challenge. Third example is in relation to soils, and I've pulled out peat in particular because I think in the Highlands and in Scotland generally we are the main peat area in the United Kingdom. We've done a very sort of back of the fag packet calculation and looked at how much carbon there is in peat in Scotland, and we've come up with that wonderful figure of 2,735 million tonnes or megatons carbon in Scotland. Some people will quote it. If you do quote it, please put all the error bars round about it, because it's pretty sketchy. But it makes the general point that we have got a huge carbon resource in Scotland locked up in peatland. And the one thing I would say is if we are going to adapt to climate change, let's keep the carbon that's in peat, if you follow me, that we need to look after that resource perhaps more than do anything else, because the resource in there is massive. And one of the global problems that we may have is runaway permafrost melting in Russia and in the high tundra, where there is an even obviously a much bigger peat resource that could release a lot of carbon and methane to the environment. But I think we need to do our little bit by looking after our peat in particular. Looking at carbon in soils in Scotland, and again, you can look at where a lot of it is. Much of it is in this area. It's in the Highlands in particular. So that's really, really important. Many of the soils are more than 35% peat content, and I think overall we've got beyond 95% of the UK's carbon is in peat in Scotland, with much of that in the Highlands. The big problem, one more. The other point in peat boglands, of course, in relation to flooding is that it holds a huge amount of water. When it's intact form, peat is typically about 90 to 95% water. And within that, the top 300 millimetres is actually where most of the fluctuation goes on. So apart from that top bit, peat bogs will actually hold on to water and release it very, very slowly. They are, in fact, a very big, very large, and very productive sponge. But not just a sponge, they're actually a sponge that holds a huge amount of carbon as well. So there's a double win in there, potentially. So, you know, if we had one thing to hold on to, it's that big carbon sponge. The problem, as I was going to say, is that much of the soil that we see, because it's relatively thin in many places, is that it's got a high susceptibility to erosion overall. So we have this great resource. We also have the potential for an awful lot of that to be eroded away through, in some cases, overgrazing, in many cases through weathering. So there is a real challenge, and I think that's one that I would say, let's take that one seriously as we go ahead. Coming to the last example, actually, Master, there's a couple. The last example I thought we'd put in relation to buildings, which is our Great Glen House, which I'd encourage you all to visit. If you haven't taken the opportunity to go up and have a wander around, then please do. And you can just go up and have a wander around. We can get someone to show you around. I think the other carbon challenge is to minimize carbon emissions from any building, not just public buildings, but private ones as well. What we've done in Great Glen House is go through the building research establishment, go through their standard process to get an assessment done to help us design the building and to put the building in place in as environmentally sympathetic way as possible. And what we've done is looked at all these issues: management, energy, transport, water, a whole range of things. That then translates into the building that you see today, which has got lots of little bits in it that each one of them contributes to reducing the carbon emission from it. So it's used a lot of recycled material, it's got a large atrium to get a natural airflow through it. So when you put it all together, you can get a building that has a carbon target of about 8 kilograms per metre per year emissions, compared to somewhere around 40 kilograms per metre per year for sort of artificially heated and ventilated buildings. So we're very low at the low end. It is the lowest carbon emission building in Scotland, so I think it's something for Inverness to be extremely proud of, that we've done it, and we've done it here. When you're doing that, when you're actually taking forward any building process like that, I think you've got to know exactly what you want. You've got to, I think, realise, as we did eventually, that that sustainability brings real benefits to the organisation. It's good for our people. Most of the staff up there like being in that building and working there, and involving them in that change has actually been really, really positive in terms of the carbon reduction. They feel they are contributing their little bit to the reduction overall. What you see coming to the end, when you link all that in the built environment, you can adapt. There are things that you can do when you put adaptation up front, in terms of where you put buildings, in terms of how you design them, and the cost doesn't need to be prohibitive. I think if you look especially at whole life cycle costing on buildings, then it's eminently competitive with other forms of construction. So there's a real benefit to be had from how we've done it. And again, as I say, you're all very welcome to come and have a look at what we've done. Putting all that together, the last couple of slides, what does that mean? It means that in relation to adaptation, there are things that can be done in Scotland, in the Highlands now. It means doing things a slightly different way. It probably means looking at a bigger scale to be really effective, from the tops of the Cairngorms right down to the coast in Inverness. You've got to look at the whole ecosystem, as I would call it, but the whole system, whether that's mountains, woodland, farmland, right down to the towns and villages that we've got. When you put it all together, I think there is actually real room for optimism and for hope. And then my final slide overall, just to reiterate that adaptation is possible, but we've got to act now. And I think, I do think, from an international perspective, that Scotland is making a good job of it compared to some others. There is a challenge here that the 2% increase is a real drive to reduce our emissions. When we're planning for adaptation, I think it would be right to plan beyond that level, and that's pretty dramatic. I think the challenge overall for all of us, government agencies, public, and industry in particular, is to get our practices aligned so that we're actually all talking to each other. There is a mix of hard and soft engineering, whether it's in coastal areas, soils, mountains, or in buildings, that we can actually work together to actually help enormously in the adaptation. I think it's that limit to barriers, it's that people thing that really we've got to focus on. I think that's why today is so really very, very important, that I'm very interested to know how